Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, January 28th, 2023. We begin with our sister Luyanda Kaboka cruising the highway of history, giving us the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be in conversation with Nancy Bristow, Professor of History at the University of Puget Sound in Washington State, and author of the book Steeped in the Blood of Racism, Black Power, Law and Order, and the 1970 shootings at Jackson State College. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Silvan Niedermeier, postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the University of Erfurt in Germany. For our purposes today, he is the author of the book The Color of the Third Degree, Racism, Police Torture, and Civil Rights in the American South, 1930 to 1955. Don't touch that radio because you won't want to miss these knowledgeable historians in conversation with our very own living library, Dr. Gerald Horne. Now, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. Now, to make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Smoke DZA with Harry Fraud, Yusef Lateef, Bobby Timmons, Charles Mingus, John Coltrane, and Freddie Hubbard. Now people get ready for this train of coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Nancy Bristow.
We have not met at this great Congress of African people to discuss unity with white people. That is not our problem today. Our problem and the gravest problem facing black people today is the unity of all black men the world over.
Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. We present this calendar to put into context the present struggle against the three evil paradigms of oppression. National oppression, what many call racism, class oppression, what many call poverty, and gender oppression, what many call sexism. It is through reviewing the history of our struggles that we gain added momentum in the ideological wars against the three evil pillars of capitalism and imperialism. February 1st, 1898. Queen Mother Moore, an African sister activist in the U.S., was born. She was an early organizer of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Later, in 1933, she joined the Communist Party due to its program of supporting the establishment of the Black nation in the 5 state areas of the South. She was a prolific organizer of domestic workers, tenants, and women in Harlem. She was a founding member of the National Council of Negro Women, as well as the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. In 1962, she joined the Reparations Committee of Descendants of U.S. slaves. She passed away at the age of 98. Alafia. January 31st, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution to abolish chattel slavery was established. January 31st, 1901 to 1974. Francine Bernard of Azania, warrior queen, was born. She was a leader of the African National Congress, the leading liberation movement in the struggle against apartheid. She was a teacher, domestic worker, and trade union leader, considered the Fannie Lou Hamer of Azania, South Africa. She led the Pass Law revolts and was imprisoned and eventually banished from South Africa in 1969. February 1st, 1960. 4 African students initiated the second phase of the civil rights movement in the students' sit-ins at the Woolworths department store in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. The students attempted to order a hamburger and were beaten and jailed by the whites for challenging the segregation laws. The following day, 23 brothers from A&T and 4 sisters from Bennett College returned to the department store facing the same punishment. Before the end of the semester, over 6,000 students from over 78 southern campuses had sat in, and over 2,000 had not only gone to jail, but were brutally beaten by the racist Southern police. Within 1 year, over 70,000 young people, mainly Africans, staged sit-ins throughout the South. February 2nd, 1848. The first draft of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceded Mexican land to the United States. Subsequently, every provision of the agreement between Mexico and the United States was violated by the United States. February 3rd, 1969. Eduardo Mondiane, founder-president of Frelimo, Front of the Liberation of Mozambique, was assassinated. Frelimo was the vanguard movement in the decolonization struggle against Portuguese colonialism. February 3rd, 1930. Vietnamese Communist Party founder by Ho Chi Minh and the Revolutionary Intelligentsia of Vietnam to liberate Vietnam from French and later U.S. colonial forces. The Vietnamese Communist Party continues today to provide a higher quality of life under socialism than under the French and U.S. colonial rule in critical areas of education, childcare, health, food, and housing. February 4th, 1969. Movimento for the Liberation of Angola begins armed struggle against the Portuguese colonialists. February 6, 1945. Bob Marley was born. The reggae superstar who during the period of depoliticization of music with the corporate-created disco craze brought reggae to the masses of humanity as a musical ideological weapon whose lyrical content affirmed African history, decolonization movements, black pride, love, and unity amongst many other themes. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka for Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara. For more information, please contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. We end this section with our revolutionary chant from Azania, South Africa. Amandla awethu, Amandla awethu, Amandla awethu.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Nancy Bristow, Professor of History at the University of Puget Sound in Washington State, and author of the book, Steeped in the Blood of Racism, Black Power, Law and Order, and the 1970 shooting at Jackson State College, Mississippi. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles, Professor Bristow.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
And it's an honor to have you. So why did you write this book, and what happened specifically at Jackson State in Mississippi that attracted your attention?
So I've been teaching African American history for 3 decades at this point, and one of the key themes has always been the long history of state-sanctioned violence against people of color, obviously reaching all the way back to slavery. And in turn, I was really interested in the ways in the 1960s that continued violence needed new language and new techniques in the wake of civil rights successes. And so I was drawn to Jackson State because this particular story has been largely untold. It happened just 10 days after the shootings at Kent State, in which 4 white students were murdered, and yet it has never garnered the same attention precisely because the victims were Black students at a historically Black university. And so I was interested both in making sure that the story was told and also in making some corrections to the way the story has sometimes been told, certainly originally by the state of Mississippi. So what took place there was that on the night of, let me start back up a little bit. It was at this point a growing HBCU, the flagship of the Mississippi State segregated system for Black students. Through its middle ran a commuter 4-lane, essentially highway called Lynch Street, named for Reconstruction era U.S. Representative Black man Congressman John R. Lynch. But this had been a site of frustration and violence and conflict for the students with white suburban commuters who drove through the campus twice a day, obviously, and would often harass the students. So every year in the course of the 1960s, there would be conflicts on the street. And on the night of May 13th, one night before the shootings, such an event had taken place. Some rocks were thrown, the police came, barricades were put up, but the police did not enter the campus. And that night, things calmed, and May 14th dawned quiet. The president of the university or the college was very concerned that there could be problems that coming night and asked the state to close off the street to prevent violence on the night of May 14th. The city and the state refused to do so. And as he had feared, on the night of May 14th, again, some rocks were thrown. We don't know who threw the rocks, maybe some local students maybe some students from the campus, but also perhaps just some local young people, again, expressing their frustration around a number of things. This time, things developed worse when some young people commandeered a dump truck and lit it on fire on the corner of campus. Now, in the spring of May 1970, this is not a major event, to be clear. This is a time in which the nation is in a complete uproar, again, 10 days after the shootings at Kent State. But the fire at the dump truck gives the city and the state the opportunity to bring in police forces, which they do, both members of the all-white Mississippi Highway and Safety Patrol and members of the almost all-white Jackson City Police. They're there theoretically to protect the fire truck that comes to douse the small fire. That's taken care of relatively quickly, and the fire truck leaves the campus. However, the state police and the city police, rather than leaving the campus, begin to march into the middle of campus. They approach a crowd in front of a women's dormitory where students were just hanging out on a hot Mississippi evening. They stop, turn, face the students, who at this point are now, of course, angry, and perhaps yelling some epithets, raise their weapons, and when a bottle breaks on the ground, the police officers open fire. They fire for 28 seconds. They fire 150 rounds. There are 400 distinct bullet and buckshot marks on the side of this building, which was in fact a women's dormitory. In the aftermath, 2 students were dead, 14 students were badly injured, and that's the story essentially of what took place. It was a horrific event and essentially one more episode in the long history of state violence against Black citizens in the state of Mississippi and across our country.
So this took place at a women's dormitory. Of the dozen or so that were either killed or injured, how many were women, and any vignettes to share about the victims?
It was split about half and half in terms of male and female victims. The 2 that died were both young men, but many of the victims were in fact inside the dormitory. Women had a curfew, and so the women had gone inside the dormitory following their curfew. So it was only men that were outside the dorm. This was a common event. The men would hang out because their curfew was later. In terms of the stories, they're all horrific. The 2 victims were really young people. One was a 17-year-old high school student who was on his way home from work at the Wag a Bag grocery. He'd been working there running groceries for white shoppers since he was 11 to help his family that had 9 children and both parents unable to work. He was about to graduate from high school, loved to run track, and was beloved in his family for his caring attitude and his great sense of humor. And his name was James Earl Green. Philip Lafayette Gibbs was the other victim. He was a junior studying history and politics. He was also married. He had a wife and 1 small child. They had gone home to Ripley, Mississippi to try to save funds. Philip Lafayette Gibbs was on campus that night and visiting his sister at the dormitory. He was hoping to become a lawyer. And unknown to him and his wife, she was actually pregnant with their 2nd child, who would be named Demetrius. So tragic loss for both of those families. The other story that I think is always important to name is Leroy Kenter. He was a really thriving student who was shot very badly. His femur was shattered. He would spend 39 days in the hospital and then would return to live with his grandmother and aunt and mother in a 1-bedroom home without air conditioning and a half body cast. He would return to school and unsuccessful. And he's always wondered since what would have happened to him in his life had he not been shot and been unable to return to school. He said when he got back, his mind just wasn't right. He just couldn't do the schoolwork. He couldn't focus. So again, the stories are all filled with tragedy. I should add one other thing, though, that there were many more victims than those who were shot, and I should correct myself. It was 12 that were visibly injured and 2 that were killed. But many more people were injured. Many suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. But what's remarkable about this class of young people is how many of them went on to really remarkable careers, to working hard to make their communities better places. And I think many of them driven, in fact, by the injustice that they experienced as young people on campus.
Now, during this era, there were a number of examples of state violence against students. You mentioned Kent State, but of course, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities like Texas Southern University in Houston, Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, were also victimized. How would you compare what happened at Jackson State to these other episodes?
I think it's of a piece with those that took place at the other HBCUs. And I would add in not only the violence that was happening at HBCUs, but we can think of the murder of members of the Black Panther Party in 1969. In fact, the first shooting of this era on a college campus also took place on a Black College campus in Orangeburg in 1968. So in some ways, it's very much of a piece with the crisis that Black citizens were facing at this historical moment in this terrible white backlash. I think it's very different for that reason from what happened at Kent State. Kent State was a National Guard assault on white students protesting the war in Vietnam. This was a racialized assault at Jackson State by an almost all-white police force assaulting students on a thriving Black college campus that was, in fact, really coming into its own in this era. This was a campus in which students were finding their voices, really in some ways, not for the first time, but for the first time being allowed to express their voices and their sense of race consciousness. So this was very clearly a repression of a thriving campus in which students were finding voice and in which they were being permitted to study Black history, to talk about issues related to Black history. They had a new Black History and Culture Center that had just opened on campus. They had a new president in 1967 who said they would have a revolution in their books. This was a repression of young people because of who they were, because they were Black students.
Are you familiar with the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, and what role did they play in generating a racist uproar that perhaps eventuated in the killings at Jackson State College?
Yes, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission is essentially a private or a state police force. By private, what I meant to suggest was this was a secret police force that had as its purpose the containment of Black protest and Black aspiration in the state. It was created to prevent the things the civil rights movement, later the Black Power movement, would be trying to accomplish. It was responsible for a great deal of state criminality, and certainly it did nothing to repress the kind of actions that both the Highway Patrol and the state police, it did nothing to repress the violence that both the state police and the city police had engaged in previously and engaged in that night at Jackson State College. It's not, there is an ongoing debate. Many of the students on campus believe that this assault was planned. I was not able to find any records to suggest that that was the case. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. It only means that I've been unable to find that evidence. And so this sense that the state was actively working against the well-being of Black people is something that is broadly understood in the Black community then as well as now.
And then there's the Mississippi question. Why is it that Mississippi has been the heart of darkness when it comes to Jim Crow, when it comes to slavery? That is to say, an epicenter of violence against Black people. Does it have anything to do with the fact that Mississippi has one of the highest percentages of Black citizens in the 50 U.S. states? Is it perhaps a legacy of the violence and brutality of the removal of the Choctaw indigenous people? Do you have any ideas of why Mississippi has been so horrible?
Dr. Horne, that is such a great question. And I think you've already offered some answers, which is I think there is a long history of extreme violence, and it's often connected to the reality that white supremacy felt in some ways some of its greatest challenges because of the closeness and sort of proportionality of population. That, I think, combined with the resultant extreme violence of the institution of slavery, of the horrific removal of the indigenous people, and a sort of a repeated practice of violence, so that by 1970, assaults on crowds of young Black people were nothing new. So I guess I don't have an easy answer. I guess the other thing I would say is, in some ways, I also want to be careful not to paint Mississippi as so terribly different from the rest of the South, from the rest of the country, because realistically, yes, the actual practiced violence was more dramatic, but the realities of ongoing repression, the realities of ongoing belittlement, degradation, this is a nationwide problem. And so Mississippi gives us a chance to pull things apart and look for practices and patterns because they're easier to see there. They're more subtle, perhaps, in places like the Pacific Northwest where I live. That doesn't mean they're non-existent. So yes, Mississippi, heart of darkness, but the heart of darkness in a very dark nation, I'm afraid.
And what about the families of the victims? Were they able to recover monetary damages? And what happened to them? Did they suffer traumatic stress syndrome or anything of that sort?
Both families did, in fact, struggle desperately from this. Members of both families with whom I've had a chance to speak talk about how difficult it was to recover, to try to rebuild lives in the aftermath. Siblings, certainly, of James Earl Green and his mother were devastated by what happened, and so also for Philip Lafayette Gibbs, for his children and his wife, who moved eventually to Arizona, in fact. No, they were not able to recover any damages. In fact, there were two grand juries, both of which relied in their practices on the sort of law and order perspective of the state to essentially find no indictments of any of the police officers present that night. The only indictment to come out of both of those was the scapegoating of one local black man, against whom charges were ultimately dropped. In the aftermath of all of this, the families as well as three of the victims who survived did sue the state, the city, the mayor, the governor, a long list of people. They were unsuccessful in their initial case, which they anticipated. They were successful on appeal, but because of the rules of state sovereignty, they were not able to receive any benefits. And so it was appealed again to the Supreme Court, who refused to hear the case. So they were found essentially to be correct, that the state had wronged them, but no, they never received any damages, and no officers were ever prosecuted.
Now, this state violence in Jackson, Mississippi was taking place at a moment when the Euro-American population across class lines was moving towards voting for the Republican Party 9-1. Does that context shed any light on the killings at Jackson State College?
It absolutely does. In fact, the Republicans are able to sway so many white voters who had been Democrats into the Republican Party through what originates or is first expressed really vividly by Barry Goldwater, but brought to fruition in the candidacies of George Wallace and then the Republican Richard Nixon, which was the use of law and order as a veiled racialized narrative to suggest that this was the candidate that would take on the job of containing Black lives. And so that sweep of white people into the Republican Party is going on at this exact historical moment, and is those very arguments about law and order that are used to justify the killings at Jackson State.
What about the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council? Do they have any role to play in this story?
They surely do. To be honest, the Mississippi Highway Police were often referred to as being essentially the Klan. And the White Citizens Council, of course, the dressed up version of the KKK, surely members of both the local and state police were members of either, both the state police and the city police. There's just no question that these white members of Mississippi's law enforcement were also likely overlapping with the membership of both of those organizations.
Finally, Professor Bristow, Professor of History, University of Puget Sound and Washington State, author of the book Steeped in the Blood of Racism, Black Power, Law and Order, the 1970s shooting at Jackson State College. What's next on your research agenda? What do your readers have to look forward to?
Well, this actually had started as part of a larger project looking at state violence in the Black Power era in different kinds of sites. This case, Jackson State, a historically Black college. But I'm also interested in a shooting during a civil disorder in Augusta that took place 6 days earlier when 6 young Black men were all shot by police, shot dead, all 6 shot in the back. And I'm also interested in state violence against those who are incarcerated. So I think my next project is going to be looking at what happened at the Long Binh jail in Vietnam, which was a jail that housed largely American soldiers, but largely Black and brown soldiers. And there was civil unrest at that jail in 1968. And though there are good oral histories collected, very little has been written. So I think I'll be looking at that exhibit again of state violence against those who are particularly powerless before them.
But just as a footnote, I've often wondered why there hasn't been much more attention to the U.S. naval vessel Kitty Hawk. which was very active during the war in Vietnam and was a seething cauldron of racist violence, particularly against black sailors. And I've oftentimes imagined that there is a substantial archive about the Kitty Hawk, and I wonder if there were those incarcerated in Long Binh prison who may have been from the Kitty Hawk.
They may very, very well have been, and you've just given me one more chapter that really, you're right, would be such an interesting and important exploration, and one that's just not been done to my knowledge. So no, thank you very much for that reminder of yet one more example of the ways in which, as we see the surgence of Black power and the expression of really wanting to claim one's voice and to be active as citizens and members of our national community, the repression came down hard, and it came down in so many different contexts, including against those who were serving the country at that very moment.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Bristow, author of the book, Steeped in the Blood of Racism. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. It is now time for more historical contextual breakdowns with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's now being joined by Silvan Niedermeier. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Silvan Niedermeier, postdoctoral researcher and lecturer in history at Erfurt University in the Federal Republic of Germany, and author of the book, The Color of the Third Degree, Racism, Police Torture, and Civil Rights in the American South. Welcome, 1930 to 1955, sorry about that. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Silvan Niedermeier. Welcome, I'm glad to be part of this. Well, we're glad to have you. So why did you write this book?
This dates back a long time. I was when I was a master's student actually at my university. I was interested in the history of the lie detector in U.S. history. I was studying U.S. history, and the lie detector came up as a topic that interested me. And while doing this research, I was getting deeper and deeper into police practices and police interrogation practices. And then when I visited the U.S. the first time for my doctoral thesis, I looked into archives. I went to New York, I went to Washington, D.C., and I encountered this trove and this massive file collection in the NAACP files on so-called forced confession cases. While my first idea about the project was rather broad, to write a history of interrogation practices in the U.S., I realized that there's a story that nobody had really digged into, a story of police abuse and the use of forced confessions to convict African American people, this was so such a stark cases that I was from then on focusing on digging into this history and bringing it to the fore.
Mm-hmm. So I take it that this book was originally published in the German language and was translated subsequently into the English language. Should I infer that there is scholarly and wider interest in the Federal Republic of Germany in U.S. racism?
There's absolutely. It has part of it. It has to do with a strong base of American history at German universities. That has to do with the Second World War too, because institutions in Germany, universities in Germany were funded by American institutions, and they wanted, of course, also to have to distribute knowledge on American history within Germany. And so we have professorships for American history in Germany, quite a lot of them, and so there's a strong research taken out by German university doctoral students focusing on American history. So it's not a surprise that I was doing that. It's mostly because we had the opportunity in Germany to study, and still have it, to study American history. And well, racism, this in the end is I would say also related to the Third Reich, because I as a history student, and also as a high school student, I was strongly interested in the history of Nazi Germany, and then encountering American history and seeing this long history of racism was really fascinating for me as a student and as a high school student too.
Mm-hmm. And just as a footnote, I take it that there is simultaneously an interest in African American history in Germany as well.
That's true too. Yes, that also has to do with the strong position of American history at certain German universities, and also I would say for a strong interest in like pop culture in Germany, and so. African American history has always been to the forefront of what people in Germany do when they do American history.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you detect a correlation between the success of the anti-lynching movement up to 1945 and the rise of what you call the third degree post-1945? And by the way, what do you mean by the third degree?
Well, with regard to the first question, there is a relation. I was actually trying to trace this in my book. There's a connection in the sense that while lynching becomes more and more contested in the South, state institutions are trying to bring the police into a position of battling, so to say, lynching. So they bring the police in. Southern state governors are more and more embarrassed about lynching. It has to do with economical interests. They want to portray an image of the South that is less brutal, and so they put more pressure on the police to step in. And in fact, what you see in the 1930s, this starts. You start an increasing number of prevented lynchings, which means that mobs come up, they capture black suspects, they want to kill them in their lynching rituals, but the police steps in and takes these suspects away, bring them into prison, and then what happens a lot of times, and that's what I was researching, is that the police forces confessions from these black suspects, and they force these confessions violently, and this is on the one hand to speed up the trials, because with the confession they can easily and fastly speed up the trial and find these suspects guilty, and then also they want to somehow send a signal to the local community that justice is still swiftly done, and so there is no need for mob law. And so that's a strong reason why police torture and lynching are connected, and the decline of lynching are connected. And the second question on the third degree,
mm-hmm.
or sorry, did you want to hear?
No, go ahead.
The third degree is somehow it's a term that was apparently invented in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, and there are police officials in the late 19th century that say the third degree is a rather neutral term. It means the third phase after detention and of the suspect. The detention, the apprehension, the detention, the booking of the subject. I'm not sure about the second step, but the third step, of course, is the interrogation, and the interrogation is then called the third degree. But this starts to change in the early 20th century. There's a shift in the definition and the understanding of the term, and then the third degree is more and more understood as a phase of using harsh psychological and physiological methods during interrogations. And this is a practice that is not only something that African American people experience. It is broadly and widely practiced especially in American cities throughout the United States. And it's a big problem of police oversight. So there's no real control, and there's no real punishment, juridical consequences for police officers when they do this and engage in these practices. And so the third degree actually gains this connection of being a brutal form of interrogations in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your study, what is the most egregious or horrible example of police torture that you encountered, particularly as regards a Black suspect?
Well, actually, when you read my book, it's difficult to pick out especially egregious example. They are all really horrible, and some of them are even so horrible that I had difficulties in writing about them. So encountering these documents in the archive, sometimes they came along with photographs of the victims. So I might point to one case in Atlanta from 1940, which is actually an important case because it's the first case in which the federal government steps in and prosecutes, makes a charge against the police officer that is involved, and prosecutes him in federal court, in the federal court in Georgia. And so this case involves a 16-year-old youth that he's judged to have for theft in gymnasium. So it's a really small thing why he's caught and why he's brought into the police station, the headquarters in Atlanta, and he's tortured with an electric device. A so-called tacking iron that the police used to glue photos to heat up glue and paste photos onto documents, and this police officer uses this device and beats and puts it onto the skin of the youth and forces the confession, and then an interesting and also quite depressing somehow debate unfolds because the Atlanta public, the white public, is enraged. Suddenly, the local Atlanta Constitution and the Atlanta Journal come up and say that this is outrageous. This shouldn't have happened. But in the end, the police officer is put on trial and first in the local court and gets off scot-free. So he's not convicted, and then. That's what makes the case really interesting. The federal government steps in. It's the first time that they investigate a police torture case in the South, and they step in and they bring up evidence. They collect testimony from various officers, from the victim, from various other Black friends of the victim that were also in jail at the time of the torture. And all this was brought up in the federal court in Georgia, but again, there are three trials actually taking place in federal court, and the jury cannot decide on a conviction, so this is a mistrial, and the case the police officer never sees consequences for this.
Now, a two-part question. I take it that young Black men were disproportionately victims of police torture. But part two is, what about Black boys and girls, Black women, Black senior citizens? To what extent were they victimized by police torture?
Well, I just told you about the case of Quinta South. That's his name, from Atlanta. He was 16. You're correct in suggesting that it's most often men. It's not only young men. So the cases that I have where police tortured African American suspects into confessions that were accused of crimes like murder or rape, like high profile cases. In these cases, the victims are not only young men. This is a men of different age. But what I also found, and this is also a part of my research, is I found several women who became victim of police torture, and these women, they come up in these federal investigations that I referred to. As I said, from 1940 on, the federal government the Justice Department starts to investigate several police torture cases, and when they do that, they send the FBI to the South, to Alabama, to Georgia, other states, and in specific cases. And when they dig up these cases, lots of people come up and complain and testify against the police. And very often, these were women who testified that they were, because of minor accusations, they were brought into the police station, beat with sticks, brought out of the police station into swamp area, beaten there by police officers. And also the FBI comes up again with documentation, with photographs, with testimony of the victims, and again they bring this to trial. And there's there's one case actually when the sheriff gets convicted, but in most of the cases the sheriffs do not receive convictions, and as I said, women are very often the victims of these atrocities.
Now, you suggest that resistance to lynching then leads to the third degree, replacing or supplanting or supplementing lynching. Talk about the question of Black resistance and perhaps how that leads to a retreat of the third degree as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's of course a big question and a really important question. It was also an important question for the book, and I can give answer on various levels to that. So you see resistance on the micro level when you observe these cases. So in the one chapter I analyze African American suspects when they are brought to court. As I said, often they were forced into confessions, and so the confessions brought into the court procedure were brought about by violence, and what these defendants do is in the court, they tell the jury about that, and they tell the court audience about it. They tell that they had been forced to give this confession, and some of them walk up to the jury benches and they show their arms and legs to the jury, and they show the wounds that they have, the scars on their body, and so even though there's most likely an audience that is not in favor of them and a jury that is not in favor of them, what they do in court is that they nevertheless want to use the situation and want to show that they have rights too, and then this is not something they want to accept. So this is on the micro level that I see resistance. It's also on a macro level, because these cases, we only know about these cases because of the NAACP. The NAACP, as I said right at the beginning of the interview, they collected these trials. They had their local chapters already installed in various places in the South, and people involved in these chapters, they wrote letters to the NAACP and told them about these cases when people had been brought to trial on forced confessions, and they bring up all kinds of support for these people. They sometimes send lawyers directly to the court procedures to support them. They appeal these cases, help to appeal these cases first to the state Supreme Court, and then if they're rejected, they try to appeal them to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they are successful in various regards. And So this is a really important aspect of this, because the NAACP, by doing these appeals, by bringing up these appeals to the Supreme Court narrows the possibilities of Southern institutions to bring these confessions into the trials. So there's various legal decisions. One is called Brown versus Mississippi, decided in 1936, that significantly narrows the possibility to bring confessions into the court that is based on violence. And so yeah, the resistance, as I said, is on a micro level, but it's also on this macro level of this strong institution, the NAACP, in mobilizing their power, their legal power, to combat the third degree.
Mm-hmm. What about any connections you spy between the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in recent years and the story you tell in your book?
Well, on the one hand, it's kind of a you reading my book and then hearing about recent cases and looking at the murder of George Floyd, and you would think that not many things have changed, but there's a connection I see, and that's the attempt of bringing about justice in cases of police brutality is always tied to people's action to bring about documentation, to make things visible, to bring about a certain public awareness and attention. And so even in these cases that I looked at in the South, there were always people who were documenting, who were doing interviews, who were showing what was going on, and then trying to bring this to the audience and achieve certain results, juridical results out of this. And so this is something that I see too with Black Lives Matter. They take up similar initiatives, they take up similar methods to combat police brutality, and so that's a connection I definitely see. So the forms of torture and also police shootings, they have this big problem that you have to hold the police accountable for it, and you need evidence, you need documentation, and that's what I see. What is holding both times and battles against police brutality together, like the battle in the 1940s South and the current situation.
Finally, Silvan Niedermeier, postdoctoral researcher and lecturer in history at Erfurt University in the Federal Republic of Germany, and author of the book The Color of the Third Degree: Racism, Police Torture, and Civil Rights in the American South, 1930 to 1955. What next for Silvan Niedermeier? Are you still investigating the question of the third degree and the police torture, or is there something else?
No, actually, since several years, I'm now working on a second book. It's on the Philippine-American War, and especially on the role of photography in this war. So what I'm doing there is look from multiple perspectives onto the war and look how different group of actors used photography in this war. So there are several chapters on white soldiers that were fighting in this war and using photography to portray themselves as imperial warriors that were in a war against as they perceived inferior race in the Philippines. But also there's a chapter on black soldiers who fought in this war and who had an ambivalent positioning in this war, and they also used photography to portray their role there. And there's also a chapter on a white woman participating and being in the Philippines at the time of the war. And of course, there's a chapter on the Philippine soldiers and the Philippine revolutionaries and their perspective and their use of photography. And so this is my new project. It's actually a project that is also getting to an end soon. So I'm hopeful to end this and be able to finish this project too. But yeah, this is something I'm working on right now.
Now, I should say, just for the sake of our audience, that this war takes place at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. And there is a particular Black American hero, David Fagan, who was sent to fight in the Philippines on behalf of the United States, but defects to the Filipino side. And begins to fight against his erstwhile comrades. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there. Silvan Niedermeier at Erfurt University in the Federal Republic of Germany, author of the book, The Color of the Third Degree. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
You have to read the history of slavery to understand this. There were two kinds of Negroes. There was that old house Negro and the field Negro. And the house Negro always looked out for his master. When the field Negroes got too much out of line, he held them back in check. He put them back on the plantation. The house Negro could afford to do that because he lived better than the field Negro. He ate better, he dressed better, and he lived in a better house. He lived right up next to his master in the attic or the basement. He ate the same food his master ate, and wore his same clothes. And he could talk just like his master, good diction. And he loved his master more than his master loved himself. That's why he didn't want his master hurt. If the master got sick, he'd say, "What's the matter, boss? We sick?" When the master's house caught a fire, he'd try and put the fire out. He didn't want his master's house burned. He never wanted his master's property threatened. And he was more defensive of it than the master was. That was the house Negro. But then you had some field Negroes.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Nancy Bristow from the University of Puget Sound in Washington State. Find yourself a Black-owned bookstore near you today and continue the learning by grabbing her book, Steeped in the Blood of Racism, Black Power, Law and Order, and the 1970 shootings at Jackson State College. Thank you to Silvan Niedermeier at the University of Erfurt in Germany. And while you're in that bookstore, why not grab his book, The Color of the Third Degree, Racism, Police Torture, and Civil Rights in the American South, 1930 to 1955. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Ted. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Baba Didan Kamati. Shout out to our sister Luyanda Kaboka on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to Freedom Now and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for a revolution.